Welcome to Rays of Hope Masikhanye, a lifestyle talk show that seeks to equip individuals, families, and communities to lead holistic and well lives that make this world a better place based on biblical principles. And we are in this episode looking into the issue of pain. Pain. And to help me look into this, I am joined by our resident pastor for this month, Dr. Papu. Dr. Papu, thank you for joining us.
Thank you. It's my pleasure to be in this show.
We really are pleased to have you. We are looking into, with you, you've done a good job in the previous episodes to show us, number one, that God is a loving God, that God is a powerful God, and that this world comes from his hands. And it looks like death is an integral part of this world. Did also God create death?
That's a good question, because when we talk about death, we're talking about suffering, we're talking about evil, we're talking about pain in God's world. And why would a loving God allow such to happen? This is a very relevant question, because if you have a loving God and a powerful God, so a loving God will not allow his children to go through pain. But he's more than a loving God, or he's not only loving, he's also powerful. He can prevent it from happening.
Sure.
You could be a loving father but be hopeless.
Sure.
You can be a mighty father, all powerful, but be cruel. So you need both, and not only loving, not only powerful, of course, also willing to save. So why does God allow this to happen? What the depth of this pain comes through when you notice Christians, people who believe in God, and they go through pain, they go through suffering. When your grandfather dies, you don't raise too many of these questions. But when a 2-year-old child dies, knocked by a car, when a bride just got married and he dies, there are certain deaths that just hit you so hard that you just want to know where is God when this happens. It's not for every death. When a child drowns at sea and is not found, and after days, and these are real stories that happen. When a person, young as it is ravaged by cancer, then you ask, but where is God? Why? And many people, because they couldn't wrap their minds around that, have actually made a shipwreck of their faith. They said, no, there's no God. It's the easiest way of dealing with that. They can't remain with God, loving and mighty.
The God that they know.
Yeah, and then there's pain. So they rather do away with God. But the reality also is even as they do away with God, but the pain is still there. You see, do away with God is not a solution. Unless you are saying he's the one who's causing it. So if I do away with it, I'll be fine. It's not a prescription. That do away with God, everything will be fine. So even when you have done away with God, you have just taken one of the options, one of the solutions that have been prescribed. But you still have to deal with death. And this is something that we forget. Of course, God is not in the picture. Now, who is in the picture? Now, who's going to deal with this? That's one. But we've also seen that atheists revel around this as they talk about God's existence, and they say God does not exist. And then they bring the whole idea of pain. Actually, if you read most of your renowned atheists, if you read their story, actually, I'm even told by Darwin that the reason Darwin gravitated towards this evolutionistic worldview is the loss of his daughter. Darwin grew up in a religious background, but the loss of his daughter almost sniffed out life and hope in his heart, and he moved towards that. So atheists also tend to look into this question and say, if he's a loving God, how can he allow this to happen? But the truth of the matter is, the Bible is real. The Bible doesn't say, if you believe in God, if you believe that God exists, you will not suffer.
Now, sorry for interjecting. Now, we are talking about God allowing it, but maybe first let's look into because if we say he allows it, then we need to have established that he did not cause it, but he created this world. and he's powerful, as you said, and he's loving, and as you said, and death is here, despite the fact that God created this one. Or did he create death? Is death part of God's design? If yes, then let me perhaps allow you to to answer that.
Yeah. The point I was trying to make is
Okay.
we are at home with this question.
Sure.
In other words, the Bible is not, this question is not foreign to the Bible.
Sure.
The prophets have asked the question. So it's not a question that says, no, don't ask that question. It is, we're at home. The Bible actually addresses the very same issue. I mean, we have a story of John the Baptist who's beheaded, very close to Christ. I mean, he's the guy who baptized Christ. Christ who raised the dead. You're talking about why does God allow? Who raised the dead? He'll raise Lazarus. But there was John the Baptist, so close to Christ, but he died and he was buried without the head.
Sure.
And the question is, but why did Christ not intervene? Okay, but he intervened with Lazarus, who was dead, and he brought him up. So you can't exactly say it's a one channel. There's another channel that we need to look at. But what is very clear in the Bible, that when God created the world, if you look at Genesis 1 and Genesis 2, there is no mention of death, except to say that if you eat of the tree, then you will die. That's when we get the whole idea of death. And that comes also as we read the Bible, and we will agree that the devil, who actually, according to Revelation 12:7 to 9, was actually originally in heaven, and messed up in heaven, fought in heaven, he was thrown out, and the very same guy was here on planet Earth and managed to lead Adam and Eve to disobedience. And the Bible is very clear that from that time on, then we're at death. Actually, God comes and he organizes death to protect Adam and Eve. So he slaughters an animal, and then he's got the skin of the animal to cover Adam and Eve. So you see, God is responsible. God is the one who provides. He uses death to cover Eve and Adam. But not only that, he chases them out of the Garden of Eden, and we don't look at that. And if you look at chapter 3, 21 to 23, it says the reason he chased them out of the Garden of Eden, so that they don't eat again of the tree of life and live.
So as they may die.
Yeah, so that death also, in a way, in a sinful world, is almost a blessing. Because here's the point, if you're going to have cancer, because this is a sinful world, but you're not going to die. Cancer is going to ravage you for the next million years, because you're undying, but because there is sin. So you live in a painful, suffering situation forever and not die. So Christ, no. Now that there is sin, now that there is pain, now that there is suffering, the only mercy that I can do, because one of the ways of showing your cruelty is to allow those who are in pain not to die. You see, when people torture you, they want to prolong your life as much as possible. So we don't want a God who prolongs life and makes sure you don't die, and yet you are in pain because the world is infested with sin. But then the Bible says, God so loved the world. He sent his only begotten Son. Now here's a plan. He says, I've got a plan. Actually, that plan comes out so nice in Hebrews 2:14. I think for the sake of our viewers, Hebrews 2 verse 13 to from 14 to 15, he says, the Christ became one of us so that he could die. So the whole idea was that he, God, because we're asking God, why, if God is a loving God, is he allowing death? But we could say, but why is a loving God dying? So the very God we're talking about sends his Son, who is God in the Trinity, and the Son experiences death, he experiences suffering, rejection, and he dies. And then he says the reason he did that is so that he could have the opportunity to destroy the one who has power over death. And he makes it very clear, and that one is the devil, is Satan. So, and then later on in Revelation 1, he says, I've got the keys to Hades and the keys to the grave. I was dead and yet I'm alive. So resurrection actually made sure that Christ has the keys. So the death of Christ on the cross actually is a part of the plan that God had. If you want to blame God, so okay, we want to blame God for creating the devil. We want to blame God for allowing Adam and Eve, giving them the power of choice, because if they have no choice. There's another argument I could raise and say, the reason there's death and suffering is because God is loving. Because if he was not loving, he would force us. He would force us to do what he wants us to do.
Sure.
But he gives us the power of choice. He says, guys, there's death, there's life. That's what he did to Adam and Eve. You choose. So we talk about evil, but in this world where there is choice, there is also good. But if there's no choice, then there's no good as well. There's just whatever. But people are able, but God makes sure that he empowers us. There's access to the source of power, so that we're able to connect with God. I think what God wants to do, this is just so beautiful. God says, guys, we're going to take care of this thing. We're going to take it. I want you to work with me. I really want you to work with me. So he sends his son. I mean, if you look at Christ, and we probably talk about that later on, how he hated death. I mean, at one point he says, I've come that you might have life and have it abundantly. I mean, what more do you want?
Sure.
Here's a person who says, here's a person who healed the sick, who fed the hungry, who raised the dead. He says in John 10:30, I've come that you might have life and have it abundantly. But the thief comes to steal and to destroy. Martha and Mary says, if you were here, Lazarus would not have died. I mean, what more do you want?
Sure.
To know that actually the God we serve is a God of life. He is for life. He is pro-life. But he's dealing with the matter of sin. The real question that we're afraid to ask is, why does God allow a rapist to live? Because now the rapist causes rape and then there's pain. So why does God allow him to live? But you can move on. Why does God allow a family that brought that rapist in the context of rejection? Just as one of the reasons why did God allow that family to exist? Why did God not destroy that family so that family dies? In other words, what you are asking of God, you are saying, God, kill all the rapists, kill all the murderers, so that whoever drives a car is fine. But God says, that's what I want to do. But I don't want to kill them. I want to kill them with love. I want them to accept me. Because once they accept me, then I know that they will not then engage in life-threatening behaviors.
I love that. We just cannot end that discussion, this discussion without touch. Are you actually saying that we are not powerless? Because, it looks like, we've got power of choice until we get to death. And sometimes we look around, we feel so powerless that there is nothing that we can do about it. And even society teaches us that and it doesn't matter, your day has come, but you seem to believe that we have a role in how we respond to death.
Yes. We can extend life.
Sure.
We can actually extend
Sure.
We can extend we can actually prolong life. Number on your own life.
Sure.
By exercising, by living healthfully, by taking care of yourself. You can do that. But not only that, but the life of your neighbor as well. Because remember, the Bible says, thou shalt not murder. Because when you murder, you bring the life of the person to an end. You can't say, no, yes, I've killed you, but your time had come. You can't argue that. You can't say your time had come. I mean, it would be, if you argue on the fact that time has come, why do we have hospitals? Why do we have doctors? Why do we have psychologists? Why did Christ heal the sick? Why didn't he just say, sorry, your time has come. There's no way I'm going to heal you. Your time has come. In other words, if your time has not come, you're not going to die.
Sure.
So you don't need to worry. Just sit there. If somebody chases you with a knife, you just say, go ahead. Stab me. My time has not come. I'm not going to die. You're going to die. And then your time will come and you will not be there. So what God is saying, he says, work with me. That's why in Matthew 25, keep coming to that. He says, I was hungry. We can prevent people from dying of hunger as government, as government officials, as pastors, as members, as neighbors, as relatives. We can actually prolong one's life by making sure that he's covered, that he's visited in hospital, that he eats. We can do that. We are not as helpless as we think we are. If we cooperate with God, we can actually prolong life. And that's where we sometimes blame God when God says, but you are my hands, you are my feet, you represent me. Why don't you go in there and make sure that neighbor, as you eat, What about next door? Are they eating? Because now what's going to happen? They're not going to eat, and that child's going to grow up in that environment of hunger. He becomes a criminal. He robs, he rapes, he kills, and then he says, but God says, but you were there. I asked you to take care of him, and you didn't, and look what he has done now. So as much as we blame God, but God looks at us. Of course, there are things that are beyond us. I mean, a virus, I don't know, earthquakes and other things. Here's the point. We have to be patient. God is going to create the world that we want. Revelation 21 says, and there will be no more death, no more sorrow, because all things would have passed away. When God creates a new earth with no virus, no COVID, the new world with no sickness, with no sorrows. He says, I'm going to do that. It's just that at times, because of pain and suffering, we become impatient. He says, yes, work with me. Even if you are dead, don't worry. Remember, I'm going to resurrect you. And when you are dead, it's not like you feel the pain. You've been dead for so long. When you are raised back to life, and then you begin to live life that is measured by God's life, it's amazing. It's going to happen.
Sure.
What we desire, what we are complaining about, God says, I've got a plan. Work with me.
I've got a plan, work with me. I was wondering, because I had a couple of questions. There are people that are watching us who have lost, loved ones, and people that are asking questions. God seems to be powerless around this. Does God have a plan? And you have answered all of those questions. Dr. Papu, I think this is the perfect time to end this conversation in knowing and being reminded and being comforted that God has got a plan for this. Thank you for joining us.
My pleasure.
Viewers, thank you for taking the time to join us. We are going to take a quick break. Please do not touch that dial and don't go anywhere. We'll be back soon.
Every community has its ups and downs, its joys and its sorrows, from informal traders, children to pensioners. Everyone sometimes needs an ear to hear. Do you need prayer? Chat with the Cape Conference virtual pastor.
Welcome back to Rays of Hope, Masikhanye. My name is Sivu. I am still your host. And right now we are continuing with our discussion on life. And the next discussion, really, we are looking into the absence of life. And to help me look into that, I am joined by Dr. Ntshalintshali. Dr. Ntshalintshali, welcome to Rays of Hope, Masikhanye. Thank you for joining us.
I'm honored to be here.
I'm looking forward to our discussion. But before we look into the nuts and bolts of what we're going to be speaking about, I think we need to get to know you first. Who is Dr. Ntshalintshali? What are you currently doing? And briefly take us through your medical journey.
Okay, so my journey has been quite a lengthy one, in a sense that I've been in many places, actually studying medicine in different areas. I started in Cuba, where I did my undergraduate studies for 6 years, and I completed it in University of KwaZulu-Natal. Thereafter, after my internship in community service, I then went on to specialize in internal medicine. I did the training over 4 years, and it also included a component of research. I decided to do research in the area of clinical immunology, simply because in South Africa there's a critical shortage of clinical immunologists. As we speak, among the adult population, doctors that attend to adult patients, there's only one physician who is a clinical immunologist and an internal medicine specialist. There's been others which are pediatrician and family physician, but in the mainstream of internal medicine, there's only one. So I was very much touched by knowing that, and I wanted to actually help people solve their problems. It was quite a touchy situation for me because I had a number of family members that belonged, that were having this rare disease called hereditary angioedema. And when I saw these patients in my clinic, I didn't know where to refer them in KwaZulu-Natal because there was nobody. The only nearest place to actually even have a discussion with someone to advise me how to treat these patients was in Cape Town. And that is where I realized I needed to know more about these conditions, and I needed to be able to assist people that have got a need. After that, getting my master's from KwaZulu-Natal, I then decided to even further subspecialize in clinical immunology. So I actually came to Cape Town. I was in UCT. Due to issues of funding, I did not really I did not finish the training in immunology, but I really got a lot of experience because I spent some time over there. And thereafter, I then decided to pursue a career in rheumatology. So I'm currently in Stellenbosch University and Tygerberg Hospital. I'm a rheumatology fellow, and I'm also doing research, completing my MPhil at this point in time. Yeah.
Thank you, Dr. Sipho, for that brief history of your medical career. And once again, we really appreciate having you here. When we are described as the human species right now, and we are called mortal beings, and then you have a sense that dying is part of who we are. Is that a fair description of the human life? Is that death is at the center of it?
I would like to look at it in a way that life and death are sort of more intertwined in our existence. And I guess if you're looking at it from a religious context, you would understand that from the very inception of creation, Adam and Eve were faced by a tree that was going to give them knowledge to certain things. And there was actually good and evil there at the Garden of Eden. So it's been there.
Sure.
And coming back to our bodies, it's quite amazing to see that actually there is death while we think we are alive in our bodies.
Really?
And that can culminate in death that we know is absence of life. What do I mean by this? From conception in a mother's womb, for someone to actually have fingers as you see in your hand, the spaces between your fingers, for them to be created there had to be death of those cells that were there. We have people who are actually born with webbed hands where that dying process did not happen. So you can see that it is a controlled balance of life and death at the same time. And that results in what we know is life.
I'm sorry for interjecting. Are you saying that in the human existence, there are times when death is a good part of who we are?
It is actually in our genes. What do I mean by this? There is a term that we use in medicine which is called apoptosis. What that means is programmed death. So every cell in your body, when it's born, it's actually got a date that it's going to die. And sometimes you find that there are conditions that can make that dying come sooner.
Sure.
And there are conditions that can make that dying not to happen. Like we see in people with cancers and tumors where cells forget that they have to die and they sometimes live longer than they should. So there is definitely a very close relationship between living and dying in our bodies.
Okay, that's quite a revelation. Thank you for that. I'm sure we're going to come back to that later on. But speaking about death, now you say that death is an integral part of who we are, even before being born, and while we are still inside our mother's wombs. Now, so that death seems to continue throughout life. But what needs to happen for that death to ultimately be called the absence of life completely? For somebody to be declared death from a medical perspective?
That's a good question. And it's not just a medical question.
Sure.
It also goes into the realms of legal medicine, because what is understood as death in one country, it doesn't necessarily apply in other countries. Well, what do I mean by that? I'm sure you've heard of a concept of brain death.
Yes.
And in some countries, if your brain is dead, you're dead. And we're no longer going to invest any money in saving your life because your brain is dead. If you can donate organs, good enough. In some countries, you actually, as long as other organs are alive, you're still alive. So that's the legal standpoint of it. But for the medical side, to say someone now is dead, we normally look at vital signs. So vital signs are things like breathing and whether your heart is still beating, you can feel the pulse, and sometimes you can connect some devices to look for electrical activity in the heart. And then you also test certain parts of the brain which are responsible for these functions, for these vital functions. So we call an area in the brain called the brain stem. So things like breathing, etc. You can test it by using your eyes, which is the commonest way that we use. We shine light into the eyes and see if your pupils they constrict. If they don't constrict, then they tell you that that part of the brain might be compromised. So we know that your brain is no longer with us. So there is that sort of easy way at bedside to determine whether someone is dead or alive. You look at the vital signs and you look at whether the brain is still alive or not.
Okay. Are there, and there's a question I'm going to be asking that I know I'm sure the viewers at home want me to ask that question, and we're going to come back to it. It's the whole issue of death and pain. Maybe I should start with it.
Right.
We know the pain that normally is associated with the activities that have led to somebody being declared dead, like car accident, being shot, and all those unpleasant experiences. But the ultimate experience of somebody just before they get declared death, is that a painful experience?
Okay. One thing about pain is that it's a subjective entity.
Sure.
So it's basically because there are people without anything going on and they're in pain. Like there's a condition we call fibromyalgia. You just touch someone and they feel horrible pain. And there are people that are supposed to feel pain and their pain threshold is so high that they don't feel pain. So it is a very subjective matter. But in the reality of it, it all depends on the cause of death.
I'm with you.
There are certain causes of death, as you mentioned, trauma and other things that by their very nature, they will cause pain before the person dies.
Sure.
But most of people that die with medical conditions, we normally see them sort of in a form of falling asleep, right?
Okay.
But there are those that it's not much pain, but they are having things like hunger for air, someone who can't breathe. And you find that their faculties are still working in their brain, but they're suffering in that way. So you wouldn't really describe that as a painful experience, but it's definitely an uncomfortable experience. So I would say that how the person who's dying actually perceives the process of dying, it mainly depends on what led to the death, what was the cause of that death.
Sure. Dr. Sipo, tell me, are there different stages of death or, to dying?
Once again, I think my answer will be slightly similar.
Okay.
In that how death happens, how long it takes, the entire process, it also depends on how you actually got sick or in a position for you to die.
Sure.
So, for example, if I shoot you in the head, you'll be dead in a matter of seconds.
Sure.
So there isn't much to say that, no, this was a lengthy process or whatever. But if I were to describe what we normally see in hospitals, in the wards, where you've got someone with a pneumonia, you've got someone with a heart attack, you've got someone with kidney failure, those people, they die in a sort of almost a similar fashion, in a sense that the body tries to compensate for whatever organ that is failing, and it recruits a lot of hormones which increase your blood pressure and many other things. When that way of trying to recover your body starts failing, then it will ultimately lead to a state of shock and death.
Sure.
Yeah, but in terms of processes, it all depends on what the etiology or the cause of the death is. And poison will have a different way how it kills you, as opposed to someone who's actually sick from an infection. Even COVID will kill you differently. So it all depends on the etiology.
Sure.
Yeah.
Of course, we are complicated beings, and with different tenets in our existence. We are, social beings, spiritual beings, psychological beings and of course, physical beings. And this discussion has been mostly looking into the physical dimension of dying. Is there a relationship between our physical life and our death and the health of the other aspects of our lives?
Definitely. The World Health Organization, when they define what constitutes health,
Sure.
they talk about a well-being in the physical realm, mentally and socially.
Sure.
That's because there's been a very close relationship seen in someone maybe who's being abused at home. They might turn out to have ulcers in their stomach. And you wonder, how is an ulcer in the stomach
Sure.
has to do with the father who's abusive verbally. You understand. And those are some of the conditions we call psychosomatic diseases. So because of the influences of other spheres of life into the physical person, then we have to look at other aspects of it. So doctors don't just heal a heart or heal a kidney or a liver. They have to look at the social circumstances. They have to look at the psychology part of it and know that you are coping, psychologically speaking, with the areas where you are.
Sure.
Because everything is actually intertwined.
Sure.
With COVID that has hit the whole world currently, there's been now a description of a second pandemic, which is going concurrently with this one that we're facing. And you know what that has been? It's been mental health. And then you ask yourself, how come are we having this problem now leading to a mental health issue? And it's been mental issues among doctors, mental issues among the society at large. And that is because we are not just humans and our bodies are isolated from everything else that is happening. And these mental health conditions, they can actually lead to physical, palpable diseases if they are not taken care of. So there's that connection that you can't really divorce one thing from the other. They actually go together.
I love that. Thank you for going into that. Let me ask you, because it's very easy for somebody that is looking at this and say, this is a very somber discussion. What's the point? We are born dying. Death is part of who we are. We might as well just accept it. And is there something that one can do to delay the shortage of death in their life? Any words of hope? What can we do from a young age throughout one's life? And in a minute?
In a minute, I would say definitely. There's a lot one can do to try and elongate their life. Look, I'll take an hour if I were to describe this. So I'll just pick one thing to make an example of meaningful things that are simple that we can do to elongate our lives. Let's just look at sleep. You know that if you don't sleep enough, you actually get older quicker and you will die sooner. And the science behind that, when you don't get to the level of sleep that we call a rapid eye movement sleep, that is the type of deep sleep where we actually dream. When you are dreaming at that time, that is when your brain, it starts producing a hormone that we call melatonin. And this hormone, what it does is it's a natural occurring antioxidant. So the oxidation or dying of your cells, making you look older with wrinkles, etc., it's actually taken care of by this melatonin. You've heard people say that people who sleep, they don't get wrinkles, and that's true. It's actually true because you don't get older because your body is being rejuvenated every time you go to sleep. And during a sleep, the more REM cycles you go to, because sleep is actually in cycles. The more REM you go into and more dreams you have, the more younger you become. So the message to this is easily looking into your sleep hygiene. You can easily turn around your longevity. You can live more than what you actually would if you do not. I know that the life that we live now, people sleep less and all of that, and you actually get a stronger immune system. During this time of COVID, if you don't want to get an infection, sleep more. And if you don't sleep, your immune system becomes weaker.
That is a hopeful place to end it, but I really think you should come back to Masikhanye Rays of Hope, and we need to take this last part. But man, before I stop, let me just thank you for your time and the insights that you've shared with us.
It's been a pleasure.
Viewers at home and wherever you are, thank you so much for having joined us. Please do not go away. Stay tuned. We'll be back shortly.
Every community has its ups and downs, its joys and its sorrows, from informal traders, children to pensioners. Everyone sometimes needs an ear to hear. Do you need prayer? Chat with the Cape Conference virtual pastor.
Welcome back to Rays of Hope, Masikhanye. I am Sivu and your host. To help me discuss a very important theme and topic of dealing with the reality of pain and loss and death at this time, I am joined by Dr. Simba Musvosvi from Helderberg College of Higher Education in Somerset West, South Africa. Dr. Musvosvi, welcome to Rays of Hope.
Thank you very much, Sivu.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate having your time here, and I'm looking forward to our discussion at this particular time. Death seems to be a part of who we are, but the question I want to start this with is, as social beings, how important is social networks in our dealing and responding to pain and suffering?
You know, often we don't think about it, but when we grieve, there is a very strong social component that goes with grieving. And perhaps to use an analogy, we can talk about celebration. Let's talk about the opposite spectrum.
Sure.
There is grief on the one side, there is celebration on the one side. Working in a tertiary institution, you know, every year I see students celebrating their success after 3 or 4 years of study. And they go through a lot of expenses to bring family to, you know, this graduation ceremony where they are celebrating. One would say, why not save that money and simply walk to the registrar's office and pick up your papers and go away? But there's something which is left missing when you do that. You can't celebrate in isolation. The truth of the matter is that grief is also very similar to that. We cannot successfully deal with our grief in isolation. There is that social component where other human beings help to facilitate that process of grieving and mourning.
Sure. Thank you so much, Dr. Musvosvi. And I love the choice of words, which, by the way, happens to be what we are going to be speaking about: grieving in isolation. And that's the sad time about the times that we live in, is that not only are we seeing so many, deaths and losses and pain, but there seems to be limitation in how we can gather around each other as we respond to that pain. Maybe the first question is this: is this unique only to the COVID-19 times, the phenomenon of having to grieve in isolation?
Actually, we find that this is something which has been in place for a long time. And of course, even if we were to go to Bible times, we will see that there are instances, so many instances in which when people come together, there is a facilitation of grieving. Perhaps going to the first book of the Bible, Genesis, you find numerous examples. One example that I'm thinking of, and we can find it in the book of Genesis, chapter 33. Jacob has been away from his family, and he has gone to Laban, where he found his, he married. And so after perhaps about 20 years, he comes back and he meets Esau. And it is at the point of meeting Esau that he breaks down. If you read in Genesis chapter 33, at that moment there is a breaking down, and the two brothers weep together, even though between them they had some tension that had been there. But the idea of them meeting together, it helps to trigger certain feelings which had been building up over the years as they were in isolation. We also look at Joseph, that is Jacob's son.
Yes.
If you read your Bible from Genesis 41, you will find that, of course, Joseph had gone through some very painful experiences in his life. But it is at the point that he recognized his brothers in Egypt that he broke down.
Yeah.
If you read the story several times, he breaks down, either just from meeting his brothers or when Benjamin eventually comes, he breaks down. And later on, when his father comes, Jacob breaks down as he weeps, embracing his father.
Yeah.
The significance of the fact that there is that moment in which there is that breakdown of grief, it actually suggests to us that there has been pain which has been going on, but somehow which could not be facilitated because Joseph was in isolation. There was no one who was significant.
Sure. Thank you, Dr. Musvosvi. Now talk to me about how what happens what are the psychological, what are the health implications when we have to grieve away from familiar faces?
I think part of what happens is that there is lack of closure. There is you don't have that opportunity to participate in these significant events that are so meaningful, that help us to come to terms with the fact that we have lost a loved one. And perhaps just to talk about my own experience, in 1995, I had just gone to the United States to study as a student, and then my brother fell ill back in my home country in Zimbabwe. And he grew worse, and until eventually we found out that, we were told that he had passed away. I had just my family with me. There was another brother who was also in the United States with his family. So it was just the two families that were there. The rest of the family were abroad, and we had no money to be able to go and join. And unfortunately, at that time, we also did not have the technology that we have. I was a poor student. I didn't even have a cell phone, and so we were limited. So we were not able to attend the funeral. There's something which was left missing. And as a family, we spent a little bit of time together one afternoon, and then afterwards we said, what are we doing? We're not participating in anything. And so eventually we had to go back to life as it was, back to school, back to studying, back to work, and back to our chores. But there is something which was left undone. It's as if there is a part of the grief process that could not be accomplished.
No, definitely.
And this is because there was a very limited network.
Yeah. I mean, you said something about, and I know it's so true, especially in our context, as our viewers who are watching, that sometimes the rituals, they help a lot with, number one, reminding you that this has happened, but also they help a lot to expedite and catalyze closure. And the absence of those rituals to meet together with your loved ones and can actually prolong or delay that closure. But is there a way, perhaps, that people can come up with their own customized rituals in the presence of these limitations that could help with the issue that we've just raised of closure?
Yes, certainly. I think you raise a very important point about the role of rituals Sometimes we tend to look at them as, well, this is just a process of disposing of the body, or it is a process in which we can be able to facilitate what we do with the property that remains, or whatever aspect of, of life we are dealing with in each particular ritual.
Yeah.
But actually, the truth of the matter is that rituals have a function that they play in helping us, first of all, to accept the reality of death.
Yeah.
That body viewing, for example, listening to a eulogy, and maybe even watching the casket being lowered into the ground, if that's the way it is being disposed of. Those rituals, those activities have a way in which they facilitate our grief process. They have a way in which, as we go through those rituals, they kind of nudge us on. They walk us in the process of grieving. And in the absence of those rituals, of course, we get stuck.
Sure.
And so perhaps there is need, and you suggested that perhaps we can customize and be inventive, be innovative, and come up with our own rituals. Certainly, we are encouraged to do that. That is actually a way in which we can be able to deal with grief in isolation. So, what kind of rituals do we need? Well, I don't know. It is something that works for you, because grief is very unique to to each individual, and what helps us in the process of grieving tends to be more or less unique to us. There are some general aspects that we can look at, but when it comes to the actual details, it can be very unique. Some people will find a lot of meaning even in working with pictures, photographs. Looking at photographs and perhaps making an album of the deceased person, and maybe even writing whatever comments you may want to write. So the nature of the ritual is not the critical thing, but it is the meaning behind.
Yeah.
I personally worked with pictures, actually not too long ago. I was thinking about my mother who passed away quite some time back. And I started also thinking about my mother-in-law whom we lost more than a decade ago. And in that moment, I decided, why don't I make join their pictures? I didn't have a picture where they were together. And for me, of course, having been born before computers, it took a little bit of Googling to find out what software do I need to do that. And I found an online tool, and I was able to do that. It took me a few minutes to be able to do that. And I guess the length of time that was that I needed to look for the information and to actually do it, it helped me to do that. So in a sense, it is a ritual that I went through because it had meaning. Some people may plant a tree, or they may do any kind of thing, but as long as it has meaning.
Meaning, all right. Like many aspects that have come with the COVID-19 pandemic, negative as they are, but if you look closer, there have been some positives as well. And then in this instance of dealing with grief in isolation, surely there should be some benefits there is a time when there is a need to be silent or a need to be alone as you deal with grief. Is there ever a time when it is positive to be alone and isolated as you deal with grief? Are there examples where that has been beneficial?
Certainly, and maybe let's just go back to a biblical example, the example of Joseph. I spoke about Joseph the many times that he broke down when he met his brothers. It is very interesting that actually many times when there was the outpouring of grief, he would withdraw from people. Something triggered the grief and maybe the mourning process.
Sure.
But he felt that he needed to be alone. And so there is the time when he revealed himself to his brothers, for example. The Bible tells us specifically that he sent everybody else out of the room. And he grieved with his brother. Well, he revealed himself to the brothers. And there was that outburst of emotions. Now, true, it may not have been grief at that moment. Maybe it was joy, but again, we see that there is need sometimes for isolation, perhaps for the removal of the big crowd, so that only significant people are there. And so in our ministering to people who are grieving, there is what has been called by some people the ministry of presence, being present with people to allow them to talk and to help them through. But there's also the ministry of absence. That is when you withdraw from people so that maybe they can have that special moment with only those who are significant. Or maybe they actually may want at that particular time to be alone. There is also meaning in grieving alone sometimes.
Thank you, Dr. Musvosvi. In a minute, and this will be my last question, in a minute, I don't know where the time has went, are there specific suggestions and advice that you would give to people, number one, who have to, unfortunately, grieve isolated from everybody else, number one. Number two, to people who are aware of a loved one who is grieving alone. So from a personalized point, but also as a group, we see somebody that we can reach out to.
Yes. Romans chapter 12, I think it's verse 15, tells us that we should mourn with those who mourn. That is certainly an encouragement that we should not leave people to have to grieve in isolation. Let's make contact with them. Let's make that ministry of presence. We might not know what to go and say, but being present is perhaps the most important thing. And you're being sensitive to what the person may want, perhaps to withdraw when there is need for that. And for those who are grieving, it is important for us to try to approximate as much as possible the presence of, let me call it the network, the social network, the support network that we have lost, either through urbanization or through the fact that we can't travel during lockdown, for example, during these times where COVID-19 is a problem. We can try to approximate the relationships by reaching out to loved ones. We could do this through regular phone calls. We can use technology to be able to attend, virtual funerals. But we can also make contacts with other relatives that we may have lost contact with, and that will then become a sort of support. And in addition to that, there are social support groups that we can be able to form even in the areas where we are. There are many people who are experiencing the same. They are also grieving in isolation. There's a way in which we can be able to connect with such people, and we can be able to share experiences, whether it is on a virtual platform or perhaps we are able to meet in small groups. We can be able to approximate that social support that we have lost. And then, of course, there is the idea of our personalized rituals that we may also participate in.
Dr. Musvosvi, thank you so much for your time, and this is where we have to come to an end. But once again, we appreciate your presence and your time.
Thank you.
Our viewers, thank you for joining us for this segment. I trust that you enjoyed it and the entire episode. We have come to the end of our show. And remember, if you have any comments or questions, send them to the email address that you see at the bottom of the screen, masikhanye@cc.adventist.org, or send or call the number that you see on the screen as well. As we come to an end, remember, the word of the Lord says, as you get the light, you take it, you go to the world and share it and make this world a better place. Go out there and become that light. Masikhanye. Till next time.